Well, good afternoon to all of you, and a warm welcome to those joining us both in DC and from around the world to this discussion on internal security in India. I'm Ashley Tellis. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and I'm really delighted to host this discussion, both because of the intrinsic importance of the topic. India is a continental sized country of enormous diversity and has been involved in a nation and state building project now for the last 70 years, struggling with the issues of internal violence, which have not been entirely overcome. And the impact of India's success will obviously have a bearing on both the future of democracy, the future of order, and the character of the international system in the years to come. So the topic is important in itself. We're also very lucky to have a distinguished panel of scholars to speak to this issue. Let me say a few words in turn, both on the topic and then welcome the participants to this conversation. In the last few weeks, we have heard a startling accusation made by the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that the Indian government authorized the assassination of a Khalistani activist who happens to be a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. We don't have to adjudicate the Canadian government's claims here today. I certainly do not intend to lead an examination of that issue. But I think it's useful because it serves as a reminder that the challenges of internal security are never far from the minds of Indian policymakers, even in peacetime. And this is understandable because the Indian state building and nation building project is in many ways incomplete. The Indian government, like many governments around the globe, happens to spend an enormous amount of money on internal security. It has a vast number of people allocated to internal security tasks. And it has a complex institutional structure that includes some of the most important ministries in the government focused on internal security. Internal security, I do not think it is an exaggeration to say, has been a chronic problem for India ever since its independence. And that justifies a closer look at how the Indian state has attempted to manage the challenges of producing order amidst the ever-present threat of violence, which manifests itself in myriad forms. Two of our colleagues on this panel today, Devesh Kapur and Amit Ahuja, have offered us a splendid opportunity to take a closer look at this challenge through a recently edited book, Internal Security in India, Violence, Order, and the State, which has been published about 3 or 4 months ago in the United States. It's a volume that looks very closely not just at the challenges with respect to internal violence, but the institutions, the doctrines, and the practices that India has incarnated in its political process to deal with this challenge. And therefore, this discussion is particularly apt at this time because the problems haven't gone away, but we are lucky to be presented with an analytical study that attempts to make sense of the multiple dimensions of this challenge. So I'm really delighted to welcome Amit and Devesh, as well as my own Carnegie colleague, Rachel Kleinfeld, to this conversation this afternoon. Amit is the associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Devesh Kapur is the Star Foundation Professor for South Asian Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, a few blocks down the road from the Carnegie Endowment. And Rachel Kleinfeld, my colleague, is a senior fellow in Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. and is one of our country's most accomplished scholars on the issues of democracy and security. She's also an activist in the best sense of the word and has worked both in the United States and with many international institutions on the challenges facing democracy and what needs to be done with respect to protecting democracy in the face of the threats that face it. And so I'm delighted that she has agreed to comment on Amit and Devesh's book and to join us in this conversation. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Devesh to present a broad overview of the challenges that he sees with respect to India's internal security, followed by Amit. And then I'll ask Rachel to comment on what she's heard before we open the conversation among ourselves and to the wider audience. So, thank you, all three of you, for coming here this afternoon and doing this program with me. Over to you, Devesh.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Rachel, for being here. And on behalf of Amit and myself, I just want to thank sort of Carnegie for hosting us. Uh, our book is sort of about order and violence in the context of state building. State building as a historical process has always been violent. Wars, revolutions, civil wars have been pretty intrinsic to state building. Violence in new states is often an integral part of the accumulation of power by the national state. In our book, we show that on most indicators of order and violence, there have been substantial improvements in India in the past quarter century or so. Uh, if we begin with, say, something that we all sort of recognize, interpersonal violence, which we normally measure by homicide rates, these are about 40% less on a per capita basis than 3 decades ago. They are an order of magnitude less compared to middle income countries like Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, and South Africa. They are, however, higher than in sort of East Asia. They're about half that of the United States. Since Ashley is here, I thought I'll compare homicide rates in Bombay and Washington, D.C. Uh, in 2021, DC had 221 homicides, Bombay had 162, and there's a 20-fold difference in population. Uh, and Bombay has the second highest absolute number of homicides in India after Delhi. So all in all, at least if you look at interpersonal violence, you definitely see improvements. If we move on to broader indicators of disorder and social instability, labor strife, student unrest, riots, election violence, all of them on labor strife and student unrest, these have fallen by literally more than an order of magnitude. So these are not small changes. Riots, if you normalize by population, are at the lowest level in 60 years. Uh, an election of violence for which we have less consistent data over time, but for a range of reasons, we believe these have also very substantially declined, especially since the early 90s. The one violence that is pretty stands out in India is intergroup violence, both ethnic violence, and a stark example of that is what we see occurring in India today in the state of Manipur in northeast India, and sort of interreligious violence, especially Hindu-Muslim violence. Uh, in our work, we show that these indicators as well peaked in the quarter century from the late 1970s to the early 2000s, and they have not fallen as starkly, but they have undoubtedly fallen. But you continue to see simmering violence on these indicators. The last is what we call violence that is directed against the state, terrorism, and insurgencies. Uh, Hamid will talk more about insurgencies, but to give you just one face of terrorism, so hijackings. Hijackings in India really were pretty much every second year between the 70s to the 90s. The last was in 1999. And it's interesting why that decline occurred, even though, as we know, air traffic in India has increased massively. And one reason was that the security at airports was used to be done by state police, by the local police, which, and Amit, I think, is going to touch on this. That has always been the Achilles heel because state police is extremely politicized. So, from the 80s onwards, gradually, a central police force took over, pretty similar to what happened in the US after 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security essentially nationalized security at airports. And you had a much more trained force. And what that is indicative of, that state capacity has substantially improved. And that is a factor, by no means the only factor, that the state has managed to control violence. Now, it is also the case in India, as many of you know, that the state is not just the instrument of controlling violence, it's sometimes also the instrument of fanning violence for all sorts of reasons around the domestic politics and electoral politics. Uh, I'll just end with two brief points. One is the absence of violence is not the absence of fear. Because violence has dropped, it doesn't mean that groups or people are not fearful. To take an example, uh, how many women think they can go out alone after 9 p.m. in any Indian city or in most parts of India? And that's so if you don't see much violence, it's because people are fearful of going out. The second is that order and violence is not like gravity. What goes up must come down. What goes down can definitely go up as well. Uh, and I think one should be very careful that none of these gains are permanent. They are very much related to what happens within India, and especially its domestic politics. And that's an issue we can take up later. I'll turn it over now. Thank you.
Thank you, Devesh. Amit?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Rachel. Um, I'm going to touch upon two aspects. One is a broader picture of how India thinks about internal security, and second, as Devesh mentioned, I'll get a little bit into India's experience with insurgencies. Uh, in the view on internal security is very much shaped by India's early experience as the independent, especially when the independent state comes into existence in 1947. And at that formative moment, partition violence, this killing at an industrial scale of between 1 to 2 million people, displacement of tens of millions, and the inability of the state at that moment to check this violence, that leaves a very deep impression on those who are in the state, but also those who are writing and making laws at that time. And the Indian constitution reflects this concern about instability, internal instability, and integrity, territorial integrity. Um, there are other parts of what is happening at this moment, which also connect to this insecurity. And that has to do with the state consolidation process. For example, whether it's Hyderabad, its induction into India, or the violence in Kashmir, later on the incorporation of Goa, all of these projects require the use of force by the state. And mind you, this is not the colonial state. This is a popular government running the state that has to resort to this form of violence. And again, that leaves an impression. And finally, soon after independence, India is already beginning to fight insurgencies. Whether it's the insurgency in central India, in Telangana, left-wing insurgency there, or in 1952, the insurgency that begins in Nagaland. And again, in very early in this process, troops are being sent to deal with and crush these insurgencies. So these three events and these three different experiences shape India's early approach towards internal security. Um, the, the importance of territorial integrity cannot be overemphasized. That is something which India places in the constitution, and the politicians in the different parties place a very high value on. And that's why every time um, there is a secessionist demand, the state has come down hard on it. India has faced prominent insurgencies in Jammu and Kashmir, in Punjab, in the Northeast, and also in central India, the left-wing insurgency. And across all these insurgencies, the state has been involved in trying to quell this violence, in trying to contain this violence. Um, the inflection point, as Devesh pointed out, was 1967 when we look at public violence beginning to explode. For insurgencies, that inflection point comes a little bit later. It comes in the 1980s when the Punjab insurgency takes off. It is controlled by about early 90s, but by 1980s, late 1980s, the insurgency begins in Kashmir. And in the Northeast, where small insurgencies have been entrenched since the 1950s, in Assam, which is the largest state in the Northeast, an insurgency begins in this period. And by the time we come to the late 90s, early 2000s, we start seeing central India, different states there are, are basically become home to the left-wing insurgency. So huge claims are made on the state's resources. The army gets involved. There is a time in the 1990s when 45% of India's infantry is being asked to deal with insurgency and is involved in counterinsurgency operations. So the army sets aside a lot of capacity. 75,000 troops are assigned to this new raising, which is the Rashtriya Rifles, which is fighting, basically doing counterinsurgency in Kashmir. Similarly, troops are allocated for insurgencies in the Northeast. The paramilitaries, the Central Armed Police Forces, are used to fight the insurgents, the left-wing insurgency. And again, there is an increase in capacity. In that 1990, for example, 500,000 troops are there form the Central Armed Police Forces. In the next 20 years, this number would double to 1 million. So serious bulking up of the capacity at the federal level. That's what happens as a result of these demands. While the police forces, who are the first responders to insurgencies, they remain neglected. So the capacity building does happen, but it happens in a particular way. There are other aspects of the counterinsurgency approach which are worth looking at. India's economic growth gives it a heft in the region, and India is able to persuade neighbors like Bangladesh, Bhutan, to basically remove insurgent groups who are taking shelter in their territory. So it gets assistance there. It's not been able to do the same with Pakistan, of course. Uh, the approach has not just been about coercion. The government has also talked under different parties to insurgents. In many states, we've had, yesterday's insurgents become today's lawmakers. So people are invited into the political process as long as they give up the secessionist demand. Um, their approach of the paramilitaries as well as the army essentially is a long-term approach, and this is both an advantage and a disadvantage, because some of these insurgencies have now been going on for 30-40 years, and so the involvement of these forces has been fairly substantial, and has had a profound impact on these forces, this kind of engagement over a long period. um, Violence has come down, and that is the central achievement in this expedition. Across insurgencies, violence has come down in the last 10-15 years. And what we see is that even though violence has been contained, not all these successes have been converted into uh, lasting peace and political settlements. So certain success, but they have not always been converted into political settlements. Uh, I want to then just close by touching upon one important issue. And Ashley mentioned this, and this is sort of worth thinking about carefully. India is has, if you think about the neighborhood it's located in, it is flanked by two nuclear powered countries. It shares a hot border with Pakistan and China. And so one would imagine that the external threat perceptions would dominate India's thinking about national security. I think the one thing that jumped out at us when we did this volume was how much the thinking on internal security matters to the Indian state, and how much it contributes to the imagination of national security. Even though violence has come down, even though there have been successes, the memory of this violence and the threat perception, those things are still around. And the state cares very deeply about the internal security matters. So this is something that, so even when we think about India's force posture in a geopolitical context, I think it's worth remembering that the state still cares very deeply about internal security matters. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Amit. Rachel, let me hand the microphone metaphorically over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you. It's an honor to be here with Devesh and Amit. This is a tour de force book. It really covers vast amounts of ground. It's a very big book. It covers vast amounts of ground seriously, very thoroughly. And I am no India scholar. I started my career in India working in UP in both princely states and along the caste belt near Bihar. But I'm no expert on India, so I'm bringing comparative expertise here. But I want to just caveat. Also, I'm just particularly thrilled to see this book because my own book, A Savage Order, really tried to show that internal security was a huge and understudied challenge. And here we now have this multi-hundred-page book on a subcontinental scale, looking at the set of issues. So I think Ashley said this earlier, but Devesh and Amit's first chapter is far, far more than a summary. It's one of the most crucial chapters of the book. I've now read it 3 times. It's exhaustive in its explication of what is actually happening in different sorts of violence. And I can't overstate how hard it is to get good statistics like that. So they've done a huge value to scholars so that we can pose some better questions than we've ever asked before about India. And I'll pose some of those in just a minute. But I just want to highlight a few of my other favorite chapters. I was quoting the Mangla chapter on Indian policing to a group of US law enforcement just last week to show them how to manage politically amped up violence. Ashley mentions that I'm an activist as well. I try to keep my scholarship pretty close to it, but I thought that the India police provided a really nice example in that case. And Azad's chapter also makes a really nice point along with Mangla's that we need to study the how, not just the why. And we scholars, especially from afar, are pretty focused on why is violence happening, why is it going up or down, and they make a very good case for getting very deep into the weeds of how is it being brought up or down with the policing, and then other chapters with various different forms of military and paramilitary forms of security. So I was left from this amazing book with a huge number of questions, but they're questions born of good work. And the highest among them is, of course, why violence has gone down in recent decades. Devesh just said that it's a more capable state, and undoubtedly that is part of the answer, that you've got a much more capable state. But it's a capable state acting against rapid urbanization, immense social dislocation, young population, all sorts of things that would make that accomplishment particularly difficult. And so, there's many ways you could speculate about this. You could point to rising GDP and opportunity, and many lay people tend to think about that, the India shining example. But those of us in the criminal field know that violence is not well correlated with income. In fact, becoming middle income is correlated with some of the highest violent states in the world, like Brazil and South Africa. Reducing inequality does have a correlation with violence, but India has not reduced inequality. It's brought the poor up, and it's brought the rich up even further. And so you've got more billionaires and so on. You could think of the second hypothesis, more of the converse, that it's not that poverty reduction is leading to greater security, but that greater security has abetted poverty reduction, creating a kind of virtuous cycle. And that may be true, but it still begs the question of this capable state and the greater security in the first place. My read of the findings, and this is extremely tentative, and I really hope that Devesh and Amit will be the ones to delve further into this, is that India right now is a security success that was abetted by some democratic decline. And I want to caveat that. It's not about the current government. I'm not speaking about the BJP government, because these trends, as Amit said, started far earlier than the current government. I also don't want to be pointing a finger at India. Most of my work in recent years has been focused on my own country's problems with potential democratic decline. And as Devesh said at the beginning, our rates of violent death are vastly higher, in part because we never gave the state a monopoly on force, even in law. And the third caveat I want to make to this is that security is important in and of itself, even with democratic decline. When you're talking about a subcontinent, nearly a seventh of the world's humanity, making people more secure, even if fear is still high, still matters. So with all those, I just want to talk about state building for a minute. Devesh and Amit, I'm sure, are very familiar with Charles Tilly, that war makes the state. It occurs to me here that war and other forms of violence helped make the modern Indian state in the way that is being in part blamed on the BJP government, but might have much deeper roots, in which a centralized state, centralized from the very beginning, as Amit pointed out, because of some of the fears there, has become more capable at the expense of state governments and to the detriment of checks on power. Some of that is definitely the police forces doubling over the last 3 decades, the institutional infrastructure of security, the effort to fight counterinsurgency growing. But that effort to fight counterinsurgency, as the book points out, was abetted by a Ministry of Home Affairs that really considered development key to security. And so while building up troops, it was also building up roads and electricity and telephone lines and all sorts of crucial efforts that would also affect development. All of that together does seem to have squashed violence in many, many ways without necessarily bringing peace. As Amit just hinted at, no peace deals and kind of a new social contract hasn't been built in. Instead, you've just had a diminution of violence. And at the state level, you've gotten sort of a hollowing out, this poorly led, understaffed policing and a very large private security sector. But one thing that has me puzzled about this is that Paul Stanlon's chapter also talks somewhat about the growth of criminal actors in parliament in India. And so while the state's central capacity is growing and more equal and more able, the state's interest at the state level in quelling violence might be reduced. And so part of what we might be seeing, and again, this is purely speculative, I really hope other scholars follow up on your work, is something of a pax mafioso in some areas of internal security, where these institutionalized riot networks that Paul Brass has famously written about between politicians and criminals and party activists, which we're starting to get here in the United States, unfortunately. Some of these may have allowed the politician in charge to sort of fuse the power that that politician holds in a criminal capacity with some of the power in the state government. So you move sort of from a roving bandit to a stationary bandit world. In the US, that's what we saw with the decline of lynching in the early 1900s as the state merged with some of these violent groups and figured out how by law to maintain some of its privilege, it managed to quell the violence. So I wonder if that's part of the story in certain states, but I don't know. I think bright spots, part of the story might be the election commission, the very strong election commission that's done such an immense job at reducing election violence. So one way to read this book is through this puzzle. How is the growing internal security accompanied by growing centralization and reducing democratization and perhaps increasing criminalization of some political actors? And how do those four things all come together so that perhaps the state is more able to keep order, but eventually might become somewhat more authoritarian? And of course, we know that authoritarian states are more able to keep internal security, along with very liberal democracies. You always see more murder in the middle. That's the statistical conundrum. Another reading might be why India had such a vast number of internal security challenges in the first place. This is sort of a dog that doesn't bark in the book, but given partition violence, communal insecurity would have made a huge amount of sense. And of course, it does continue. But all of these insurrections, the Naga rebellion, the Mizo rebellions, the Naxalites, Sikhs, Jammu and Kashmir, and so on, actually very few of those are really about communal issues. They're ethnic, they're territorial, also religious, but not necessarily communal. And so it may seem self-evident that a poor, weaker democracy with many people, porous borders, and so on, has difficulty with the production of order, and it is somewhat self-evident. But India was a really unusual state in having such a capable military, despite being a rather poor and heterogeneously capable state, as Devesh has written otherwise. And so I think it's an interesting question. And it also had pretty low inequality. So given a poor state, that there wasn't a lot of reason to capture the state, along with a strong security apparatus and low inequality, those variables don't usually correlate with that number of challenges. And I'm interested in why that happened. And that led me to my last point, which is on social norms. Again, Devesh has written a little bit about this. Everything I'm saying is sort of footnotes to things Devesh has written in various different forms. But the social norms on caste, on communal issues, and on gender might have vitiated the state's ability in its early years to enforce an equal order, at least in northern India. I don't know southern India nearly as well. And my one critique of the book, and I hope this is a critique that might lead to further work on behalf of the authors, is that it focuses very much on the institutions of state to maintain internal order. But I would love for the authors to delve more into how social norms and state capacity interacted, because we know everywhere in the world that most security is actually maintained through social norms. The state only gets involved on the edge cases, as it were, because you have to be an authoritarian state to maintain the kind of control over a billion plus people that you would need without the social norms moving in tandem. And so in India, the performance being mediated by these norms of caste and gender and hierarchy might have abetted the unusual amount of violence we saw at the beginning of India's statehood. But it doesn't explain why it's gotten so much better in India, even as these social norms have, if anything, somewhat solidified. As the middle class has grown, we haven't necessarily seen a reduction in some of these norms. They've altered and they've changed, but Milan Vaishnav, my colleague at Carnegie, has charted how the Indian middle class actually upholds many of these early norms. That's actually surprising in and of itself. Usually people think of middle class as a stabilizing democracy. But in this case, we're seeing a middle class that seems to be stabilizing security, potentially at the expense of democracy. And I find that just extraordinarily interesting. And for a country that, as I said at the beginning, composes so much of humanity, using the amazing work that Devesh and Amit have begun here to start working from real statistics and real facts to start teasing out some of these trends is just an immensely important and useful problem. So I commend them and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. I wanted to, why don't I start by offering Devesh and Amit the chance to offer any responses you might want to some of the questions that Rachel tabled. I have a series of questions that I want to ask, which I will, after you take a stab at an answer to her questions.
Maybe I'll go first, Hamid.
Sure.
Uh, so, so Rachel, thanks so much. I mean, all the questions you've raised are uh, really important for us to understand, and uh, I think many of them we are aware of, but frankly did not have good explanations for. And I'm just thinking aloud here. See, it's clear that in the Constitution, law and order is a state subject. It's not a central subject. And while the GOI gets blamed a lot, but actually it's the Indian states that need to bear much greater responsibility. And indeed, it is the failure to uphold those responsibilities that has led to this centralization. Centralization is an outcome of the failures of the subnational governments to invest in their police forces. We, I myself have looked at least 50 police commission reports from the early 1960s, each one saying almost identical things. Invest a little more in the police, give them a little more autonomy, all basic things of hygiene almost, which have been they everyone agrees and promptly disregards. Uh, and but I think paradoxically, we might actually, even under this government, see greater democratization, not less, at the local level. Local level was where social hierarchies were the most trenchant. They were really, that's where caste and social norms and gender absolutely. And we have, this famous sort of saying attributed to Ambedkar about villages and how they were cesspools of X, Y, and Z. So I think what the 73rd Amendment passed in the early 90s did was it gave much more decentralized power to the third tier of the government. And we know it's been a mixed bag, but the third tier local governments have relatively democracy, they have elections, and it's a much more vibrant political space uh, in the last few decades than it was in the so-called heyday of India's democracy, when it was much more at the national level, which is what we normally sort of observe. The second thing that has changed, and we think but we cannot show why homicides have declined, is that rural India, the type of caste violence that used to occur, is now much, much less. You almost don't hear of any caste massacres in Bihar and UP, and the way they used to occur in the 70s and 80s. The lower castes are much more empowered, and if something happens to them, they fight back. And that fear makes sure that the upper castes are a little more careful. Even if the nothing happens, they'll file a, a police case. And in India, we know the process is the punishment. So you're locked in courts for 10, 15 years. Your life is hell, even though you're legally out of jail. And I think this part uh, that old thing by Eleanor Ostrom, that some public goods are co-produced between the state and society, and primary education and law and order are two very good examples of that. And I think it is interesting that social norms, in the way that order in India historically was never really provided by the state, other than at a very macro level. Order was provided by society. right? It was the family that provide, the family hierarchies, the joint family and patriarch. And then outside the family, it was the caste system. In North India, you have the phenomenon of Kap Panchayat, which used to enforce the social norms. Both of these are, the joint family is now a much weaker social institution. See, a majority of Indian families, even in rural India, are now nuclear families. Kap panchayats, etc., is much, uh, it's still there, but it's nothing like the way it used to be. Uh, and so I think we could argue both ways. One is when social norms are weakening, you might potentially see greater disorder. Social hierarchies are unpleasant, but they do provide order. And when social hierarchies weaken, then you might see potentially greater disorder. But as I illustrated with the case of caste, they might actually be a greater source of order because of the ability to fight back, so to speak. And this is because the lower castes have votes. I mean, this is where universal franchise matters. It matters in local elections, it matters in national elections. They cannot be ignored. They simply can't be ignored. So I think I see this as uh, this relationship as a mixed relationship, and I'm still not sure where I come out, where this is going. But I do say, and this is what I end with, I think in a way that all of us know, but it's again very hard to pin down. Social media is playing a role in ways that in the past we simply didn't. You think there's a lot more violence and upheaval happening because of the constant bombardment by social media. And that old saying that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. There are no halcyon years in India's past. I mean, this is, I think, something we should not have any illusions. Yes, these were nice in the metros and so on where the old elite lived. But, I think now the old elite is facing challenges in the places where they rule the roost. But the rest of India is also changing in ways that are, I think, at least in my case, the jury is still out where this is going. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Amit, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I do actually. I want to sort of just quickly touch upon on some of the questions that Rachel raised. And I'll try to just do this very quickly and briefly. Rachel, you asked why not, why don't we see these issues at the state level turn into internal communal tensions? I mean, Punjab is such an interesting example where there was a prominent insurgency, and yet it did not turn into a communal issue. And I think a lot of these experiences, show us that these whether these secessionist demands or insurgencies have been conversations with the central government, and therefore they've played out in a particular way, and they've not had that kind of deep fragmenting impact on the societies where these insurgencies have been located. um, you also raised this very interesting and fascinating question about how do you get elected politicians who have a criminal record, and at the same time you are getting you start getting the violence begins to come down. And I think that the election process is such an interesting example of that. But what is interesting is that even as criminal politicians are getting elected to office through political parties, at the end of the day, these parties needed, and especially as parties proliferated in the 1980s, 90s in India, and party competition goes up, they needed an independent and they needed a credible referee. And that's what allowed this demand, this need in the political process, allows an election commission to start using federal troops to protect polling stations. Every polling station gets 5 soldiers. That has a deep impact on not just how franchise is used by the lower caste, but also bringing down electoral violence in a very significant way. Um, India is growing. There are all these issues. Inequality is a problem. Why no violence? Well, so one thing that runs parallel, as we show in our introduction, to the decline in violence is a continuous increase in protests. So it's not that contention has left the building; it is very much around. Protests in India have actually gone up. These are mostly, over 90% of them are peaceful protests, but agitation politics, protest politics is very much around and is reflective of some of the tensions that you're pointing to. And finally, I want to come back to what Devesh was talking about. This is something that I'm studying systematically with a colleague of mine. This issue of caste violence, especially norms around them. Laws were put in place, which come down hard on especially when there is violence against the Dalits, and these laws are now being implemented more rigorously. We see within the police force, the representation of lower caste has gone up over a period of time. And so even though you may not get judgments in all these cases, the fact that this legal infrastructure exists, it matters. And what we're seeing on the ground is that norms on violence are shifting. What was acceptable 20 years ago in response to violation of caste related expectations, hierarchy related expectations, that is no longer acceptable. And it's not just the pushback from the lower caste, but also among the dominant castes. There is a realization that there'll be consequences. And so we are seeing a shifting of norms in that regard on caste relations and hierarchy. It exists it manifests itself in all kinds of ways. But on violence, especially, we are beginning to see these things change. And also, I think it's important to remember, what has changed because of growth in India in the cities is it has further accelerated the breakdown of dependence. Ultimately, hierarchy turns on the dependence of the lower castes, who were primarily in many places agricultural labor, and and the dominant caste of the landowners. So those relations in rural India have really begun to change rapidly. And this is not a recent process. We've seen a rehearsal of this process in peninsular India, even in colonial times. But now with economic growth, a lot of this dependence has broken down. And therefore, you see more pushback when there is coercion and enforcement of hierarchy.
Thanks, Amit.
Can I just clarify one thing? So Rachel, just to be clear, the criminal politicians are strictly, they are those who have criminal charges against them. They are not legally, they are not convicted. So now, why that's the case is a separate story. But strictly speaking, they are the same status as former President Trump. So there are charges, but
Understood. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Devesh. That was a good clarification, also an amusing clarification. I have one question. We have many questions actually that have come in from the audience, and I will urge you to be brief in your responses because I want to get through as many of them. But I want to ask one question my own because it pervades the book in many ways. Clearly, the reduction in violence is a central theme. How one explains that, Rachel explored the many dimensions of that question. But it seems to me it's also paradoxical because even as you described the reduction in violence, You also describe the hollowing out of many major state institutions which are involved in order production. And what seems to me to be relatively novel and new in India's history, the rise of the state as the facilitator of violence. So, could you sort of speculate in some sense? Are these going to be new permanent trends, or is this something that is just transitory in the context of India's development? The hollowing out of institutions and the rise of the state as, if not a perpetrator of violence, certainly an accessory to violence on the part of social groups that are favored by the state.
Well, actually, as an existential question, everything is transitory. Uh, so, with that in mind, see, I don't think that all institutions have hollowed out. I just don't think that's the case. Surely, the many of the security institutions of the central government are actually strengthening. They're not hollowing out. That's where you see the greatest increase in state capacity. I mean, the surveillance capacity of the Indian state is, pretty serious now. Uh, Now, even see, I think a lot of when we think of the hollowing out of the state is when we think of apex institutions, Supreme Court, Parliament, etc. But if you look at local police, local courts, which is where 95, 98% of the interactions of citizens with the state takes place, right? They were, first of all, forget hollowing out, they were non existent. In the 50s and 60s, if you went to a central state like Madhya Pradesh, a police station was just spatially the presence. There were no roads. So there's this phenomenon called, dacoity in India. And you see, dacoity is different from a robbery. Dacoity is if it's committed by more than 5 people, it's a dacoity. If it's less than 5, it's a robbery. But in the past, in the badlands of central India, if there was a dacoity, there were no phones. Even if somehow the police were informed, they had no jeeps. Even if they had jeeps, there were no loads. So the idea that they would get there in time to catch anyone was non-existent. Right? Now, cell phones everywhere, amazing construction of roads. The police are well equipped with vehicles. Dacoity has fallen very sharply. So, in that sense, I think certain organizational capacities have really improved because of the broader processes of state building. And I want to emphasize this is a long term process, right? These things don't occur with one government or the other. It's been going on, right? In fact, many of the the federal government's institutional architecture on internal security is not the result of this government, but the previous NDA government after the horrific attacks in Mumbai. Just that changed the architecture of internal security in the US after 9/11, exactly the same thing happened in India. This government simply took it further. It did not start them. And so I think it's this thing that it would be, I think, just a serious mistake, as I see in many of the debates of this hollowing out. There were, as I'd said, there are no halcyon, things that everything was so nice and wonderful, and now look, it's so terrible. It's just not the case. Some things were not that great in the past, some things were excellent, and vice versa.
Let me take two questions from the floor, and I'm going to tie it to one of the themes that you also emphasize in the book. Two questions. One is, what role does Hindu nationalism in India play as part of security challenges? And the second is, how will past events and impressions of India's security be healed over time, particularly state-led violence against minority groups? And this ties to the question that I sort of touched on, which is the state as perpetrator, and also the pronounced absence of reconciliation, which you'll also emphasize in the book as one of the features of India's approach to order management.
Amit, you want to start, and then I can follow up if you want.
Yeah, I think you look, when it comes to how does the state think, or how should we think about violence that was perpetrated by the state, so I think there are two aspects. Number one is, if we look at the experience, in different states in India, whether it's Kashmir, Punjab, Northeast, in the past, today, there's one interesting feature that for political reasons, short-term political gains, at times, we do see the state willing to provide impunity for certain forms of violence. Invariably, across all these cases, history tells us that this does not turn out well. Every time a state will share or decides to share its monopoly over violence with private actors, something that Paul Staniland also talks about in his chapter, they create long-term dangers for the state, irrespective of what party it tries to do that. And second, I think there is a long-term problem here. I'll give you one simple example. I mean, think about the magnitude of partition violence, and then think about, where are the museums, where are the monuments, where is the larger conversation about what happened in the society at that time? Whether it's Pakistan or in India, we've just been terrible about dealing with injustices. I mean, the Partition Museum in Punjab has just come up recently. I visited that museum, and again, it's a reminder that so much more needs to be done around similar events since independence in India, where some degree of honest conversation, reconciliation, acknowledgement of injustice can actually happen. And that's something that we've not been able to institutionalize in India from the very beginning.
We are unfortunately running out of time, which is our biggest enemy whenever you have interesting conversations. But there is a specific question that I wanted to put to you all, because it comes from the floor, and it is a question about the response to insurgency movements, and whether you have seen the insurgents as well as the security forces adapt their strategies to deal with the problem, including, for example, innovations like social media in recent years. So there's a long history of insurgencies. Do you see evidence that the insurgents, as well as the state forces dealing with the insurgencies, have been innovative in terms of how they approach their objectives?
So Devesh, can I take
please.
a stab at it? Yeah, no. So there is a lot of adaptation and innovation that takes place. For example, the way the Rashtriya Rifles were configured, that is an adaptation in itself. For example, these were larger units. Counterinsurgency in mountains is a highly labor-intensive task. And the fact that these units were placed in a particular area and they were stationed there permanently, was primarily for the sake of developing local linkages and connections so that you had continuous intelligence flow. And that seemed to have worked. Every time there were serious human rights violations, those units were moved. But that is one innovation that is clearly been used in Jammu and Kashmir. But you've seen similarly among the insurgency. If you look at just the insurgency from the very beginning, it began as a local insurgency. As the Indian state begins to counter it, the component of foreign fighters went up. There was a time when 8 out of 10 militants being captured or killed in Kashmir were from outside India or outside the valley. And then again, we've seen a recent phase where the insurgency became, local again, and we are seeing a shift away from that slowly, in the last year and a half. So this, in some ways, cat and mouse game or adaptation and counter adaptation that continues. Of course, social media is again one of those places where the fight has been joined, and it plays an important role simply because of how widespread cell phone penetration is in India, irrespective of whether it's an insurgency zone or not.
Well, I want to, unfortunately, I have to bring this to an end despite my own inclinations to the contrary. But I don't want to let you guys go before I say thank you to each of you, first for commenting on the book and for this discussion. And of course, to Devesh and Amit for having produced such a fabulous book to begin with, which I suspect will drive many conversations of this sort in the months ahead. So thank you and all the best to the three of you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Pleasure.